right, so we've talked about the DOM in an earlier module, and we looked at the elements or the general elements that are in HTML and how we add and remove and delete those elements. Well, now we're going to add an extra dimension to it, and we're going to talk about how we use the DOM as a sort of visual medium for handling our animations and our graphics. And as such, we need to start with a brief discussion of the HTML elements and CSS that are specific to graphics and animation. Okay. All right. So we looked at those earlier elements that I talked about, and they were things like how we use the input element to grab, text from the form or submit a form. We looked at, inserting text in the paragraphs, grabbing values from text fields, inserting elements in the list. All right. Those elements are good for forms and such in the general web page, but what are the elements that are more so help us with developing visuals and adding images and animating images on a page? So let's take a look at those. All right, so the first one is one you're probably already familiar with, which is the image element or the IMG tag. All right, so what does the IMG tag do? It allows us to add images that we already have into an a web page. And the most important attribute that you're concerned about with the image tag is the source attribute, which allows us to specify the image that we want to include in that placeholder. All right, so for instance, you see in the third bullet point, image source equals http ccits.sbc.edu/images book.jpg. So putting this tag into a web page would allow us to display whatever book.jpg image is held at that location. All right, and here I'm using the URL, but it could just as simply be a file location on the server. All right, and if we wanted to do something like that with JavaScript, then look at the next bullet point where we use our familiar get element by ID. So what are we doing here? We're grabbing from the DOM some element that has the ID footer, and we're storing a reference to that in a variable called footer, and we're creating an image element. So we're using document.create element, passing img, which creates an image tag. And we're setting the source attribute to http blah 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 blah, and then we're appending it to the child, appending it as a child node of the footer. So that's the JavaScript that would allow us to add an element dynamically via JavaScript to a footer. All right, the div element is the next important element we need to talk about. And you can consider the div element sort of as a blank slate, sort of as a placeholder that allows us to insert graphics and things from scratch. All right, what does that tag look like? It's simply the div and the end-div tag, and you'll see this a lot in JavaScript working with the div. All right, so here's an example of some JavaScript utilizing that. Here again, we're grabbing a reference to the footer, so whatever element has the ID footer, and we're creating a div, right, using the create element div, and then we're just appending that div as the footer. So basically all that did was add a flat square, pretty much a flat box with no height to the footer. All right, but that alone doesn't do much for us. It's when we start manipulating that div and adding other things and controlling, customizing its visual properties that we start to get interesting. So how do we manipulate its visual properties? Well, that's where CSS comes into play. All right, so CSS is the technology that we use for the visual or presentation technology of our web pages. All right, so we use HTML to create the elements, and then we use CSS to pretty them up. All right, so the most important DOM property here when we're dealing with CSS is the style property. Okay, the style property expresses how the style attribute may be applied to all the elements of a particular type. For instance, let's say we wanted to apply a style to all paragraph tags, or we want to apply a specific style to all divs with the ID footer. All right, so we would give each one of those elements that ID or class, and then we'd apply that style to the via CSS to all elements with that style. All right, so we can apply CSS to individual elements by using the style attribute of the element. All right, so each HTML tag has a style attribute that we can set. Or if we have access to the DOM element via JavaScript, then we can set the style property on that, okay? Now, CSS rule that selects a single element by its ID, attribute, and property, all right? So we can use a CSS rule as well via a CSS style sheet. Okay, so here's some examples of that. So let's say we have a paragraph with the ID introduction. All right, so it's just a simple paragraph tag. Inside that paragraph tag, we'd have some other tags and text, blah, blah, blah. Key part is to remember that we have an ID here. So remember I said that we can set the style via the style property in the HTML. So the second set right here shows us where we have style equals border dash style solid. We're creating a solid border around this paragraph, okay? Now, in HTML, excuse me, in JavaScript, we would get a reference to it. So here we see our document.getElement by ID, and we're passing it the introduction ID, which would grab this paragraph that has that ID, and we're using .style, which says access the style property, and then we're saying .border style, which says access the border style property of the style object on the paragraph object, and we're going to set it equal to solid. All right, so that's the equivalent of what you see above it, where we set the actual style property via HTML. All right, so we can also, another key thing that we can do is via JavaScript set all the elements of a particular type. All right, so what are we doing here? Here we're using get elements by tag name. This is different than our get elements by ID. We're saying get elements by tag name, and we're passing it a tag. So what this does is it retrieves a list of all the elements from the HTML page that have the paragraph tag. So all paragraph tags are retrieved here, right? And then we can iterate through it because it gives us back a list. So here we see a for loop, and we're using we're iterating over each one of those p elements. All right, and what do? We're saying the element at the ith position accesses style object and access the border style property of that style object and set it equal to solid. So this would grab all the paragraph tags and set the style, the border style, to each one of those to solid. Okay, that's going to be very helpful for future projects. All right, here's just another example. Now here we're not using the tag name. We know that with CSS, we can give our elements a class name, and then we can apply style to that class name. So this would actually retrieve all the elements from the page that have the class name pop up. And again, we can iterate through it and manipulate its visual properties using the style property. All right, and now some of the newer syntax that we can use what's called a CSS selector. So let's say we wanted to retrieve all the images with a class of thumbnail. All right, so we can use query selector all. So notice document.querySelectorAll. All right, and we pass it the element type dot, and then the following part is the class name. So any image with the class thumbnail would be returned by this query. All right. Let's say we want to get the first link in the nav element with a class of selected, so which means a nav element that's been selected. We're applying the class. We usually use selected as a class. All right, so we're saying document.getElement by ID nav, so that's going to return the element, the first element whose ID is nav. Then on that, we're using query selector for any anchor tag with the class selected. All right, take care.